People of Reddit who have heard someone say their dying words. What were they and how did they impact you? My grandpa had Alzheimer's. I don't think he could speak for the last month of his life. I don't believe he said anything close to his death. Before he entirely lost his speech though, I was visiting him in the nursing home. He looked up at me with the most love and happiness I had ever seen on his face and said, Irma. Irma was his first wife who committed suicide before he ever met my grandmother. My grandmother was horribly abusive to him and never allowed anyone to talk about Irma, including my aunt who was Irma's only daughter. It broke my heart that he didn't know me, but I was thankful he had forgotten what happened to her. It's fitting that was the last thing I ever heard him say. One of the last things my mum said to me whilst on her deathbed was, "It's okay, let it all out. It takes a real man to cry." Whoa, what a great mum, even loving and supporting you up to her last moments. I'm sorry for your loss. Sending a hug if you want it. My father had been moved to hospice and I had been called to come because he was going to die soon. When my father saw me, he said, "I know why you're here." Looks at my sister, because she thinks I'm going to die. Turns to me, "But I'm not gonna do it." He never spoke again, slipped into a coma and died 3 days later. My dad. Stubborn fellow. LOL, what an absolute legend. That really freaking hurt, said by the 16-year-old who ran a stop sign in front of my truck. He'd been drinking, celebrating getting his driver's license at about 2:30 p.m. the 25th of April, 1986. I gave up driving for more than a month. Stopped eating and taking care of myself until I got therapy. I'm sorry you have to carry that with you. I hope you've been able to find peace with it. Save my baby. I was doing an impromptu C-spine on a woman in a car crash. She said it right before she passed out. She was 5 months pregnant. I'll never forget her voice. My dad loved us kids, but he adored our mama. We always knew mama came first. They'd been married 54 years when he had a severe reaction to his first, only, chemo treatment and died within a week. His last words were an answer to my question, "Do you want mama to lay with you?" He said yes. My brother and I moved him to the side of the bed that helped our mom crawl up on the bed and lay in his arms. My dad never opened his eyes but he puckered his lips for a kiss and mom gave him a kiss. It was the most awful, beautiful thing I have ever seen. He lived a few more days but never regained consciousness. I took a picture because it was so beautifully sad. One day after my mom has passed I will share it, as it truly is the face of love and devotion. Welp, I'm crying. I want to go now. From my granddad who had spent days being kept alive by machines. He said that just after the last of our family arrived to say goodbye. Reminds me of the last words my grandfather said to me. We were in the hospital and he turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It's my time, I'm ready to go." Didn't see him again before he died a few days later. At the hospital, my grandfather told me that when I would be on my deathbed someday, I would not regret the mistakes I made or the times I looked foolish. I would regret the things I never tried and the missed opportunities. I was 16. I took his advice to heart. Good thing I did because my cancer has progressed beyond what known science can do and having no regrets makes this much more bearable. Hang in there, man. Life won't end when you pass away. You'll be part of humanity, and you will remain alive in people's memories. My brother was briefly conscious and said to me I was dreaming. He died shortly afterward, after 9 years with ALS. I hope it was a good dream, but it somehow made me realize what a lot of fun we had growing up together. That was 18 years ago and I still miss him every day. My uncle passed from ALS. Your story really hit home. We still walk every year for a cure. Sending hugs XX. My twin sister heard our granddad's last words. They were, "Please don't leave me. I'll be dead by morning." The hospital wouldn't let her stay, and he died about 2 hours later. I don't think she's stopped feeling guilty since, even though there was nothing she could have done. Frick that hospital. My uncle died when he was 22. I was 19. When hospice came they told him they couldn't leave without him understanding that he's dying. After the nurse left he told me, "Call my friends. I want to see everyone before I die, but not the shitheads. Don't call them." It was so funny and heartbreaking at the same time. They weren't his final words, but that night he died and it was devastating. But I always think back to the things he said to us that final night. So many funny and wonderful things that were also so heartbreaking. Worked as a career for elderly people. One lady was 92, had been married for 70 years to her husband who passed away 1 week before. He told her he'd wait by their tree with the roses for her because she was scared to die. When it came to be her turn, she woke up for the first time in days, opened her eyes and said, "I knew you'd be there waiting," and passed away. Just shows that some people are made to be together. Made us all cry though. That's just so beautiful. My father passed after a long battle with cancer when I was 15. His last words to me were, "You will always be my favorite memory." The cancer was affecting his brain at that point, so it was one of the only lucid-ish things he said to me that day. Got it tattooed to me the day I turned 18. As a dad myself, I know your dad spoke from his heart. After a number of strokes and living in an assisted care facility, my dad's organs were starting to give up. He was adamant about not receiving any treatment and we respected that, so we knew it would only be a matter of days. The last time I visited him before he slipped into a coma, I told him I loved him when I left, like I always did. He said, "I love you too, my girl." At that stage he had barely been able to make himself understandable for months because the strokes had severely affected his speech. He was the best dad ever, and although we knew how much he loved us, he was not one to say it often. Those few words gave me peace, and that's the best thing one can ask for when a loved one dies. My mom just passed in February under similar conditions. She was in a rehab to get her home. Things were not going good and I stopped on my way home from work. She was surprisingly up and coherent. I spent about 4 hours there talking and all seemed good. As I walked out the door after saying many goodbyes, she yelled to me, "Hey, I love you." "I love you too, Mom." She never woke up the next day. My mother's last rational words to me, before she went to sleep for a week and the dementia and cancer took her, were, "I freaking hate this." My mother said something similar throughout her 18-month cancer battle, and at the end, "I hate this. It's not fair. I love you too much." I'm in medical imaging, and not me but a co-worker once heard a patient say, "You're killing me," while doing a long scan. The patient died during the test. All the scan involved was the patient laying still. I'm not sure what he died from. During my EMT schooling, my instructor said that when a patient tells you they feel like they're dying, and they're not on psychedelic drugs, you should listen to them because many times, they are. Nurse here had a patient look at me and tell me he thought he was dying. Then bam, he died. Super freaking quick. Was a DNR. Do not Reciting, so couldn't take any actions. In all my years of nursing it's only happened that once and never happened again. But you can bet your last dollar that I pay super freaking attention to what my patients say. Heck yes. When I was in EMT school, my instructor said, if someone tells you they're going to die, there is a very good chance that they're right. Get the defibrillator pads. A customer was complaining to me about his rental car's auto stop feature. Then he started making a death rattle sound and fell to the ground with a heart attack. It felt like it took the medics forever to get there, and as far as I know he didn't make it. It bothered me for a while that I was part of what was most likely this man's last conversation, and it was so meaningless, and he was at the airport by himself. It was so sad. Made an insanely stupid drive through a snowstorm in January 2014 with my wife fiancé at the time. We got married that coming August to see my grandma who was in her last days. The usually 4-hour drive took almost 7 and there were multiple points I couldn't see any road and was eking along at a roll just trying to keep myself out of the ditch. We made it there late at night. My mom showed me in grandma's room the silver sequined jacket my grandma had picked out to wear to our wedding. It was already hanging out and set aside even though the wedding wasn't for months and she probably knew she'd never make it. I sat next to her for an hour that night and she stirred awake only once for a short time. She smiled and got out only one word: happiness. She passed away the next night. I took it to mean that she wished us happiness and wanted my wife and I to live it each and every day. I try my best to live up to that. My grandfather told my At the time, boyfriend to take care of my baby girl. A few months later, after 9 years of being together, he's been previously married, he proposed. He told me what my grandfather said and why it was so important for him to spend the rest of his life taking care of me. It was a very sweet moment on many levels and I will never forget it. So did you stay married or don't leave us on a cliffhanger? My grandmother, but really my mammy. Her last words were to me, she said, "You're my baby." Grew up in a very conservative Catholic country. My birth mother had me when she was young and her mother ended up taking me and raised me as one of her own. I found out about it years later but never really got on with my birth mother. Having the woman I still consider my mam validate that on her deathbed meant the world to me. Was in the back of an ambulance doing CPR. Defibrillated the guy. He came around for a second, looked us dead in the eye and said calmly and clearly, "Could I please have another pillow?" Then he died. I was out of town the day before my grandma died. She called me to make sure I had breakfast. I told her I had porridge. She used to make it for me when I was a kid. She knew I was lying because who has porridge at a hotel? She said, "Make sure you eat breakfast every day." Then I told her, "I love you. See you tomorrow." She replied yes. Last thing she ever said to me. Now I hear yes as "I love you too." Like when I ask my son to clean his room and he says yes, yes, yes. I know intellectually he means go away, you're annoying, but I hear it as "I love you too." That's sweet. My condolences. My dad's last words were off Rick. It made me realize that dying is rarely the gentle, peaceful event that people imagine it to be. He was in a lot of pain, and the drugs the doctors gave him to counter the pain and intended to give him some peace made him extremely agitated. He was so dang frustrated the night he died, because he really did not want to die. It was awful. Hitch Kent Midge Neat me. He doesn't know me anymore, does he? The last words my grandmother spoke to me when I took my Alzheimer's-stricken grandfather to visit her in the hospital the evening before she died. They were married for almost 70 years. She was fully cognizant and she was right. He didn't. That is so heartbreaking. I read so many posts above but this made me cry. I can't imagine not having the love of your life not remember you. The pain alone. It was last year. My grandfather and I were pretty close to each other and I will always admire him. He was dying of lung cancer and it was in his final stages. They gave him morphine so he was just sleeping. I honestly, though he was already dead and start crying, I was with him and my family for like 4 hours and he barely say a word. It was my birthday sadly, but his last words was "Happy birthday, I love you." That must be incredibly difficult for you. I can't imagine that. This has been a real wake-up call. I need to make changes in my life. He had a stroke the instant he finished that sentence. I was standing not far from the foot of my grandmother's bed as she lay there dying. I suddenly sneezed a couple of times, which broke the deathly silence in the room. She slowly opened her eyes, rolled her head over to look at me and just stared. Me. "Oh, didn't mean to wake you, Gran. I'm sorry." Her balls. She passed not long after. That seems like a great memory. She got sassy just one last time. "Just let me sleep. I'm just napping. I'm fine." The guy who laid down in the parking lot at 5:45 am at the convenience store I was managing. He was super confused as to why they were doing CPR. Turned out he had a blood clot that caused a heart attack. Those were his last conscious words to me as I held his hand waiting for the ambulance. Thanks for holding his hand. In an EMT, like, first aid is always priority, and I suggest everyone get training. But if you don't know what you're doing or can't do anything anymore, even holding their hand is better than nothing. We do it too. Something about your comment stuck out. Don't stop not being a bystander. The bystander effect has killed and just adds to the chaos. Fiance died in my arms right before the wedding. Mine is more on the sad side, not very inspirational. I was with my fiance for 10 years, and he died 11 days before our wedding. He had heart problems and one morning he ran in the bedroom saying that I needed to call 911, and then looked into my eyes and said, "Oh my god, I'm going to die." Then he fell on the ground. I jumped over, did CPR and screamed "I love you" over and over and over again until the ambulance arrived 5 minutes later. I wanted him to know that he wasn't alone, that he was loved. I have nightmares about that moment. Half of me wishing that I hadn't been there, for selfish reasons. But my dad said, what better way to die than in the arms of the person you love, with them saying how much they love you. Not many people get that dartened because of those words. I hope that when the time comes, I die in the arms of someone I love, and the last thing I hear is I love you. So my advice is, tell your significant other, friend, family member you love them every moment you get. You can never say it too much. My granddad was the definition of grumpy grandpa. Seriously, the moodiest old jits to walk the earth. My dad was his eldest son and their relationship was always kind of tense whenever we visited, but he always had a soft spot for me as the youngest granddaughter. He used to read lots of poetry to me and play cards with me when I was little. You name it. Emphasis on the poetry. His love of poetry is likely what caused me to love literature English so much. Well, we visited him in the care home a lot once he had been moved there because he'd recently hard passed a heart bypass or something too. Stubborn man. And he was on his last legs. Grumpy and no less, since he was confined to a bed in a lonely room. Well, my dad sort of cleared things up with him, as much as father's sons do, and left the room to get some tea. I got a bit tearful because I'd never seen my gramps in such a state before. Skinny, pale, hollow-eyed, the works. I just remembered the smell of his leather jacket and his morning walk to get cigarettes and the newspaper from down the street. I'd go with him every time we visited and he'd always buy me a packet of Smarties. So he saw me tear up and took my hands, told me not to cry, you know, be strong. The usual. I didn't really know what else to do, so I just kind of looked at the TV. I can't recall what show was on, but it was just on for background noise. Then my granddad suddenly started reciting Remember Me by Christina Rossetti. He got through maybe the first 4 lines, then forgot, so I pulled it up on my phone and read the rest to him. Dad came back but Gramps had fallen asleep. We stayed for another hour and a half or so before giving him a hug and a kiss goodbye goodnight, leaving him to sleep. That was on a Sunday evening, around 7 or 8. We would have stayed longer but the care home grandparents' house was 2 hours away from where we lived, so we had to set off. Monday morning while my dad was driving me to college, his phone rings. He wants to ignore it but it bothers me because he never gets calls like that, so I tell him to pull over and answer it. I make quite a fuss. Eventually he misses the call but gives me the phone to check the voicemail. The care home informed us that my granddad passed away in the early hours of the morning in his sleep. I read Remember Me at the funeral. My grandfather died 15 years ago. When my grandmother died last year, her last words before going to sleep were, "Grandfather's name, come get me, it has been so long." My grandma passed away last year and my dad and uncle would take turns watching her. She had severe dementia. They heard her shortly before she passed, over the baby monitor. "Husband, I'm coming to see you. I can feel us getting closer." My dad's last understandable words were his nickname for my son. When I brought him in to say goodbye, frick me, I wasn't trying to cry my eyeballs out at 6 AM, but here we are. Wasn't his very last words, but very close. My grandfather as he lay dying said, "Nicky, you come to see me, boy." He was his beloved border collie farm dog that had been gone for 10 plus years. I like to think he came for him. Still tears me up. I love that dog too. I've seen patients start talking to a deceased person or pet before they pass. I'm agnostic, but I almost think they come for the dying person. It's a wildly believed fact in Indian tradition. Sometimes people at their last dying moments can't let go of their bodies, which in turn prolongs the suffering. So, to help them, people pour osmum tenoflorum water. It's seen as a sort of helping hand for the unfortunate to cross the border. Wish I could articulate better. Towards the end of my grandmother's tough battle with cancer, she couldn't just let go. After helping her with osmum tenoflorum water, she started repeating MAA, "I'm coming," over and over again until she passed. Those words stuck with me. Having lost my dad when I was 18 and he was 38, hearing about old people dying and calling out for their parents terrifies me. I know I'm going to have to miss him so much for such a long time. I Can't Breathe and Help Me are two that stick with me. Hardest part of being a nurse is not being able to save every patient from dying. Big hugs for you. I had a cardiac arrest while fencing, the sport. Apparently my last words were I can't breathe. And a nurse who was fencing on the strip next to mine heard my words and saved my life. CPR. Even some open heart surgery later on and I am good as new. My grampskins moaned and pointed at stuff and my dad was all pee off having to fuss over this and that. Then when dad wasn't looking, Gramps grinned and winked at me through his frail barely can communicate state. He was always a smart butt and just wanted to annoy dad. It wasn't dying words, he probably had a few weeks left in him. Just the last I saw of him. The day before my grandfather slipped into his last sleep, my car broke down. He heard about it and gave me a lot of money when I visited him. The last thing he said to me, I wanted to see you smile for one last time. Man, I'm even tearing up right now. He sounds like one heck of a guy. Not her dying words, but the last words my great grandmother said to me were not to marry young. No, to make the same mistake she had made. She was 94 and I was 19. I really took her words to heart. I married last year at 35. The last time I saw my grandmother, she was in the hospital dying. I had my boyfriend at the time with me and she said, don't marry young. Wait on it till you're ready. I'm pretty sure she was really saying, don't marry this guy. He's not right for you, but still had tact enough to not say it directly. The guy was not right for me. So glad I didn't marry him. Good advice, grandma. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.